Thabo Mbeki is ready to assist the new ANC leadership to renew the party. Mbeki is an ex-officio member of the ANC National Working Committee. In a wide-ranging interview with our foreign editor, Sophie Mokwena, Mbeki expressed his thoughts on the state of the continent, the country and the ANC. He's welcomed the establishment of a State of Capture Commission of Inquiry. The former president spoke to the SABC on the sidelines of the AU summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
As you know, when we we finished the report as a panel on this illicit financial flows, we submitted it, and it was adopted by the summit of the AU as AU policy. I think that was 2015. Was it 2015 or 2016? I can't remember now. But anyway, it was adopted, and immediately afterwards, there was the international conference held in Addis Ababa on financing for development. So what happened when the AU summit adopted our report, it then changed the mandate of our panel and said that it was now the responsibility of the panel to follow up on the implementation of the recommendations which it had adopted. So we exist even now as an implementation panel to follow up on the matter of the illicit financial flows. It was in that context that we then had to raise the matter of what were then decisions of the African Union Summit on this matter at the International Conference on Financing for Development, which had basically adopted those positions. Matter was later raised, we had to follow up in terms of this discussion at the UN on sustainable development goals. So also the UN adopted basically the same position, that it must therefore, as part of the pursuit of the sustainable development goals, include this matter on its agenda of combating these illicit financial flows. So basically what was adopted by the African Union has become global policy. It's accepted by everybody. So in that context, we've therefore, as a panel, after that, we visited Washington to talk to the U.S. government. We spoke to the IMF, spoke to the World Bank, went and spoke to the OECD in Paris, spoke to the European Parliament in Brussels, spoke to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. So we've covered, spoke to the UN, particularly the ECOSOC, which was representing the United Nations as a whole in New York. So we've spoken to all of the international organizations that are relevant to this matter to say that we need to, all of us, agree on a common program to pursue the decisions that we've taken globally now in that context to implement the struggle against these illicit financial flows. So everybody is in place, and we've set up with all of them the necessary cooperation mechanisms so that we can follow up practically on this. And of course, there's another matter in that context which relates to the implementation of these decisions by the continent itself. And with regard to that, the African Union is expecting us to give a report at its July summit as to what each one of the African states, member states of the African Union, what each one of the African member states are doing to implement these decisions that were taken. So we are now working with the Commission of the African Union to get these reports from the individual African countries. We will then, out of that, prepare a comprehensive report to present at the AU Summit in July as to what the continent itself is doing, in addition to what the rest of the world is doing, in terms, as I was saying, of our contacts with the IMF, World Bank, European Central Bank, and everybody else, the European Union, etc. But there will be this report on what the African continent itself is doing to implement. And we're hoping that that report, in particular, the African one, we are hoping that it will educate us about capacity because it's important that, as you would have seen in the decisions that were taken, our recommendations which are adopted, we're saying that it's important that the African countries must have the necessary capacity to deal with this matter, which is very important for development on our continent. And that capacity includes the necessary legislation, for instance, against money laundering. It includes institutional mechanisms. If you don't have strong tax collection authority, which is not corrupt, which therefore must make sure that everybody, including the major private companies, everybody pays their taxes, then we will fail to discharge this. So I'm saying that the institutional, legal, and other capacity will be able to make an assessment by the middle of this year as to the capacity possibilities on the continent, country by country, because that's important, because in terms of our interactions with the rest of the world, we've raised this matter about the need for the rest of the world to assist us to improve this capacity. So, for instance, we have an agreement with the European Central Bank, which said they would therefore be willing, as the European Central Bank, to give such assistance as may be required to help to strengthen the African central banks so that they are able to discharge their responsibilities. That's the same thing in terms of tax authorities and so on. But we'll be able, I'm saying, by the middle of this year to make an assessment as to what is the capacity in the African countries, so that we are then able to assist to make sure that if there are capacity shortfalls in any of the African countries, we are able to generate necessary support.
Do you think there is a political will on the continent by African leaders to do just that?
Well, Sophie, as we were preparing the report, as you would recall, we had to visit a number of African countries. Not all African countries, we chose certain countries which be more or less representative of what's happening on the continent or in regions. And in all of the countries we visited, there was very close and immediate cooperation we received from all the countries, including the heads of state. In all the countries, for instance, that we went, we would visit Nigeria, for instance, and we want to pay a courtesy call on the then president, Goodluck Jonathan, and he would call the whole cabinet. So we talked to the Nigerian cabinet and say, this is what we're doing, and so on. And after that, all the ministers who are relevant to the work would meet them. And more or less that's happened in all the countries on the continent. So the cooperation was there. Plus, you see the reason that it was possible at an AU summit for the summit to adopt all of the recommendations that we made, including changing the mandate of our panel, is because indeed everybody on the continent felt that this was important to achieve the objectives set here, because the continent is losing huge sums of money which it needs for its development, which it does not need to lose. And so the willingness, the political will, was related very much to everybody understanding that if we succeed in the task of retaining these resources on the continent, we increase enormously our possibility to address these development challenges, whether it's building new factories or building roads or providing schools and clinics and all that. So I think that that kind of mood and atmosphere persists, that people understand the importance of retaining these funds on the continent.
Mr. President, when you look at this, perhaps if you were to quantify, how much do you lose as a continent?
Well, at the time we're preparing the report, what we could quantify with figures drawn from the trade figures that are maintained by the IMF, because we wanted to be as accurate as possible, not to guess, not to thumbsuck, was we came to the figure about $50 billion a year lost through these illicit financial outflows from the continent. But in fact, later, this is just from the trade problems. But later calculations actually increased that to more than 80 billion. Hopefully, yes. I mean, hopefully that a Judicial Commission of Inquiry will also look at what might have happened in terms of the illicit outflows from South Africa in connection with the state capture issue. It would be important actually if they looked at that question, because it would help the country in terms of understanding how this is done. How is it? What is it? I mean, you've had these allegations made of illicit financial outflows from South Africa to Dubai, for instance. So to answer the question, practically, how does that happen? How is that? It's a very important question to answer, because then it tells you what it is that you need to do to make sure that it doesn't happen. So I'm saying that I really do hope that the Judicial Commission would look at that, because again, you see, you've had many reports which indicate that South Africa also loses very significant sums of money through these illicit outflows. When we're doing our report and interacted with SARS in South Africa, the Revenue Service people, they gave us an example of this, where one South African company had managed over a number of years to export in this illicit fashion $2 billion, one company. Unfortunately, the South African tax authorities cooperated with the Swiss and the British tax authorities, and that $2 billion was actually brought back to South Africa. But it was only one company in South Africa with these illicit outflows. So you can imagine the size of the problem if there are a number of countries who are doing that. So I'm saying that hopefully the Judicial Commission of Inquiry would look at this, if indeed it has happened, and try and detail it, because it would help the South African government to be able to say, well, this is how this thing is done, therefore the following interventions are necessary to make sure that it doesn't recur.
What's happening in the DRC?
The summit concludes. We are going to be having a meeting, a number of us, former heads of state, will be meeting with the chair of the commission of the AU and members of the commission to discuss these challenges of security on our continent. That would include South Sudan. Because the chair of the commission thought that it was important that he, as the chair of the commission, should try and draw us, many of us, who've been dealing with these issues, to try and listen to what views we might have. South Sudan will be one of them. So the engagement by IGAD on regard this matter has been important and needs to continue. But it's very important that everybody should support IGAD in a very active way. As you would recall, the IGAD is involved now with South Sudan in what they call a revitalization process, to revitalize that thing. But there are serious problems, like, they agree more recently on a reinstatement of the ceasefire, but it's broken within a few days after. So, there are serious problems of this kind. So, no, I'm saying that there is a hope that something will happen, but I think we will need to look very seriously at what has happened with the attempts to resolve this problem since December 2013. Because we are now in January 10, 2018, it's more than 4 years later since this problem, fighting broke out. And so we've got to look at what has happened in the 4 years, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And in my view, I think, if necessary, go back to the drawing board in order to reflect. If there's anything that we say didn't work, then we've got to find a way of something that will work, so that indeed the fighting in South Sudan comes to an end and all that. And so, because, millions of people who are suffering. And so a solution has to be found.
It's not all doom and gloom on the continent.
Yes, I think that you're quite right. There are positive changes that have been taking place on the continent. It was good that the change happened in the Liberia, right, in the way that it did. You remember when current President George Weah, when he ran for election in 2005, I think it was, and lost, to then the Prime Minister, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. He wanted to contest that. We talked to him. President Obasanjo, President Kufuor in Ghana, myself, to say to him, it's not necessary, because it looked to us like the elections, it was a credible outcome. That is young, 11 opportunities. So let's not, you remember we're coming out of the years with Charles Taylor, that the outcome of that election was important for Liberia. Let's not challenge it in the way. So fortunately he agreed, George Weah. And indeed we had said to him, look, you'll continue to run, and one day, and he has won. So I'm glad it's happened like this. Quite smooth, quite, even with all the court challenges there. And of course there have been the changes that have taken place in Zimbabwe. I think the positions that have been taken by President Mnangagwa with regard to addressing these challenges of Zimbabwe, I think is correct. I was very pleased, for instance, when he visited Morgan. That was a very good signal of the need for the Zimbabweans to work together, which is what we've been insisting upon for all of the years. That is really the solution of the Zimbabwe problems lies in the hands of the Zimbabweans, not imported solutions. And I think that even the way, I must say, that the way that the new administration under President Mnangagwa has dealt with President Mugabe and the Mugabe family, I think has been very good, very positive. Whatever their differences might have been, but I think they are showing a lot of respect for the fact of the role that President Mugabe played and so on. And after all, these are old comrades. They were together for all of these decades in both in the struggle and in terms of running of the thing. So I think that the posture they are taking with regard to a number of matters there, I think is very positive and very important. And again, I think that we should, all of us, do what we can, whatever assistance, support is necessary to give to Zimbabweans, to rebuild and address the economic challenges, the political challenges, and all these challenges. To have elections, President Mnangagwa is saying that they would have elections before July, to have the elections, and hopefully this time that nobody should contest the outcome on the basis that there was fraud and there was violence, there was all that. I think these are positive things. So true. I mean, it would be incorrect to say that the continent is all doom and gloom. I was in Kenya on behalf of the African Union for their elections, presidential elections, and other bodies there. And in the end, a lot of court cases, but it was important that the Kenyans, disagreeing about many things about those elections, accepted that they would go to the courts to have these matters resolved, rather than that they would resort to force. It was important. And there are challenges now because of the posture that is being taken by the opposition, which is, of course, challenging the legitimacy of the outcome. But again, you see, these are matters that were resolved in the Kenyan courts, and we would want to say, let's keep to that route in terms of the resolution of these problems. And already, I'm saying the Kenyans, to that extent, showed the way forward, such that even the Supreme Court annulled the elections that took place in August last year. And of course, that's why you had a rerun. And President Kenyatta and his party, the Jubilee people, accepted the court decision. They disagreed with it, but accepted it and said, oh no, if the court have decided, therefore let's say. I think we should sustain that. That was a positive development. But I think, Sophie, in other words also, you know, maybe something that is not on your questionnaire there. You know, one of the things that has pleased me greatly recently is the way that the rest of the world has responded to this unhappy development, otherwise unhappy development, which is the death of Hugh Masekela. But really what is very inspiring is the way not only South Africans, but the rest of the world, the way the rest of the world has responded to this. In the way that people hold Hugh in high esteem. Because Hugh represents, I think about when I thought about the matter, that you have Hugh. Hugh was a professional musician, a real professional musician. I mean, sense of going to school for 5 years to study music, and loved music from childhood. It's how he ends up as a musician. And you have a situation where for many years, for centuries, from Europe and all that, you've had a very negative attitude towards the Africans. The Africans are not capable of producing anything. They are subhuman and so on. And you get somebody like this, like Hugh, who becomes this superstar in music. And everybody in the world, celebrating this great achievement. So I'm saying that looking at you, I say, but this is exactly the kind of African who makes us to be proud to be African. And what the celebration of Hugh now that he has died is one of these positive things that's happened. Because I'm saying to myself, at least you've got people or examples like Hugh Masekela who are able to generate that feeling and sentiment, certainly among the Africans, both Africans in our continent and in the diaspora, that, we are actually capable of doing something excellent. And hopefully that kind of spirit inspires these Africans to do other excellent things in order to honor what Hugh Masekela has done. I'm saying these are some of the positives that I think we should all of us recognize.
Your views about the conference and where the country is, particularly your organization as the former president of the ANC and the ex-officio member of the ANC.
Well, I think, Sophie, that the leadership that has come out of that ANC conference, of course, is making the statements that they are making about a united organization. The issue of unity is important. The issue of renewal of the ANC is important. All these other things, fight against corruption and so on, which are correct messages. But I think we need to give them a bit of time, this leadership. We need to give a bit of time for them to address the agenda which they are stating. The ANC veterans, when they convened the National Consultative Conference, which then adopted a declaration, those veterans took part of the declaration, the operational parts of the declaration, and presented them to the ANC conference for adoption. They were discussed in one of the commissions quite thoroughly, but there was no formal adoption. I'm raising that because one of the issues that the veterans raised correctly is that the process of the corruption of the ANC has been going on for many years. And that is why the ANC has faced that crisis, such that the leadership today says one of our tasks is to fight corruption, even in the organization. This gatekeeping and then buying of branches and that kind of stuff. And the veterans have been saying that thing has been going on for a long time. The consequence of that is that you then have a corrupt system that is entrenched in the organization. And if you want to renew the ANC, you've then got to clean the ANC. Because obviously, there are many people, corrupt elements that have become embedded in the ANC from the branches up to the National Executive Committee. If you talk renewal, you've got to talk about making sure you cleanse the ANC of that element that has managed to come in because of these years of corrupt practice. Now, I'm saying that that was a proposal that came from the veterans through the National Consultative Conference. That proposal was never adopted. But you are not going to achieve the renewal of the ANC if you don't do that, what the veterans proposed. So that's why I'm saying I think we should give this leadership a bit of time They are talking about renewal of the ANC. Let's see what they do practically. I'm citing one example. And the veterans are saying, for instance, that the ANC for many years, which is true, has had this document through the eye of a needle and said, people who want to access positions of leadership in ANC, we need to put them through such processes as are visualized in the eye of a needle. And that's correct. It's the ANC policy. It's not invented by these veterans. It's been their thing now, I think since 2001 when we drafted and adopted this thing. But even if you look at the leadership today, the leadership that was elected last month didn't go through the eye of a needle. So we have not implemented even ANC decisions. But in any case, the leadership is saying we're committed to renewal. Let's give them a bit of time. I think the statements that are being made are correct, like renewal, fighting corruption, those are correct. It's the doing that has to happen. And I do hope that they will do it.
And finally, when we meet the ANC President, Tate Ramaphosa, what will be your first message to him?
It's exactly that. I mean, it's exactly that. To find out what it is that the rest of us can do. He has spoken about publicly about the need to interact properly with the veterans, which was a problem in terms of the last NEC of the ANC. He's now spoken publicly and said this must happen. Sure, I agree, that's necessary. So he needs to indicate, I'd want to discuss with him what it is that the rest of us need to do in order to support the positions that have been stated. As you say, I'm an ex-officio member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC in other structures of the ANC, so I therefore have a responsibility in that regard, but they are the immediately elected leadership, and they need to give us an indication, I'm saying, of what it is that the rest of us can do to support initiatives such as those, like the renewal of the ANC.